There's an old saying that goes, seeing is believing, which poses the question, how much are you willing to believe in something before having witnessed it with your own two eyes? In the world of pro wrestling, there's been promotions that in the past have too often dealt us with false promises, which is why a promotion building goodwill with their audience in this day and age is so important. When All Elite Wrestling was founded in 2019, there was one thing that the majority of the wrestling audience wanted, and that was for them to establish a working relationship with New Japan Pro Wrestling. For many, including myself, New Japan Pro Wrestling is considered the gold standard in professional wrestling. So if AEW could have found a way to work with them, it would have made them a force to reckon with. But for 2 years now, it seemed like that relationship just wasn't going to happen. Politics and pettiness from both sides prevented both companies from establishing any type of working relationship. That is until the only major corporate roadblock decided to step down, and a once-in-a-lifetime worldwide pandemic found both promotions with their hands tied, which led to the fabled Forbidden Door being kicked wide open and creating an industry-changing moment. This is Tranquilo Club, and this is at long last the arrival of New Japan Pro Wrestling in AEW. It's quite literally impossible to talk about the formation of AEW without bringing up New Japan. The reason this company was even possible was because the 4 EVPs, Kenny Omega, Cody Rhodes, Matt and Nick Jackson, were all making a name for themselves in New Japan. In particular, Kenny Omega was being lauded as the best wrestler in the world during his time in New Japan, where he was leading the Bullet Club. These men were helping New Japan Pro Wrestling print money and help the promotion reach new heights in North America. So much so that New Japan wanted these men to be at the forefront of their upcoming expansion into the United States. And it seemed like a perfect match. After all, the Elite were all about changing the world. So what happened? Well, according to multiple interviews from the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, Tony Khan entered the picture at the very last minute and offered the Elite a far more lucrative deal than New Japan was offering. Kenny Omega himself has said that he had 3 offers on the table, one from Tony Khan, one from New Japan, and one from WWE. Omega confirmed that of the 3 deals, New Japan offered him the worst one money-wise. This led Kenny Omega to join his friends in America to help get AEW off the ground. But it wasn't just about the money. All Elite Wrestling was offering the Elite a chance to change the wrestling world in a way that New Japan just couldn't offer them at the time. But just because they chose AEW doesn't mean that they didn't want to work with New Japan anymore. The Elite made it a goal early on in the formation of AEW to establish a working relationship with New Japan, but several factors played into this deal not happening early on. For whatever reason, when it came time for offices from both sides to meet up, Tony Khan would choose to send AEW Vice President Chris Harrington and the Young Bucks. And New Japan didn't like this. They saw this as a sign of disrespect. They saw it as AEW not being serious and wanting to do business. And not just that, there were also rumors that the New Japan office felt disrespected by the fact that they invested so much time and money into turning the Elite, in particular Kenny Omega, into bona fide superstars under their umbrella, with plans to make them the centerpiece for their expansion in the United States as mentioned before, only for them to just walk out on New Japan and leave them high and dry. In the eyes of the corporate office, of course, and that's an important detail that I'll get back to. It was also reported that New Japan just wasn't confident in AEW's chances of succeeding. And who can blame them? Since WCW went under, we've heard so many rumors and seen so many failed attempts from multiple promotions trying to establish themselves as a big name, legit alternative to the WWE. The fact of the matter is, emotional wounds were still fresh here, and it just wasn't the right time for the companies to strike a deal for a working relationship. Despite the offices from both promotions unable to come to a deal, wrestlers on both sides would openly admit that they wanted this partnership to happen, but it wouldn't. AEW, however, would allow a couple other wrestlers to sign separate deals from their AEW deal with New Japan. This just meant that you got to see Jon Moxley and Chris Jericho compete with both AEW and New Japan, without any type of working relationship needing to be established. but that didn't stop wrestlers from both sides endlessly teasing the fans, including one of the biggest and most beloved names in New Japan, Hiroshi Tanahashi, who along with Chris Jericho created a buzz in the wrestling world when they decided to make the focus of their Wrestle Kingdom match the AEW World title. And also in the lead up to this match, Tanahashi would introduce us to the phrase that we would endlessly hear from this moment on. In an interview with Tokyo Sports, Hiroshi Tanahashi would say that if he were able to beat AEW World Champion Chris Jericho at Wrestle Kingdom, then he would open the Forbidden Door and ask for an AEW World title shot. And of course, the Forbidden Door was a reference to the rocky relationship between people in AEW and New Japan. But just the fact that Chris Jericho, the AEW World Champion, and Hiroshi Tanahashi, one of the most prominent New Japan stars of the last 2 decades, were pushing so hard with this and making so many references to this so-called Forbidden Door, created such a buzz in the wrestling world that everyone was starting to believe that this partnership might be possible after all. And because of this feud, New Japan finally acknowledged AEW and posted about them on their social media and even mentioned them on air on Wrestle Kingdom. And because the feud had become so much about the AEW World title, Chris Jericho would make his entrance into the Tokyo Dome wearing the AEW World title. It was truly a surreal moment for wrestling fans seeing the AEW World title on New Japan's biggest show of the year, especially after reading and hearing about how both companies had heat with each other. But despite all the teasing in this feud, it was reported that a relationship between AEW and New Japan still was not happening, once again breaking hearts of wrestling fans around the world. A worldwide pandemic would ultimately hit anyway, and it seemed like AEW and New Japan just went their separate ways for the rest of the year. Or so we thought. It would be announced later that year on September 2020 that Harold May, the president of New Japan Pro Wrestling, would be stepping down from his position, which by itself is absolutely huge news, especially because he gave the company their best financial years in their history. But when this was announced, there was more news that came with it. It was reported that Harold May was the biggest roadblock on the New Japan side in making the AEW New Japan relationship happen. For whatever reason, he just didn't want to work with AEW. But with him gone, this meant that the Forbidden Door could now possibly be opened. But realistically, it couldn't happen anytime soon, being in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. Or so we thought. Jon Moxley, who was the AEW World Champion throughout the majority of 2020, was also the IWGP United States Champion. But due to the travel restrictions put into place because of the pandemic, he wouldn't be able to travel to Japan to defend the belt. And he couldn't defend it at an American New Japan show either, because while Tony Khan did allow some of his wrestlers to wrestle for New Japan, they still had to be exclusive to AEW in the United States. This was disappointing in particular because Kenta from New Japan Pro Wrestling started to take aim at Jon Moxley, both on New Japan shows and social media. It was obvious that this was the next match for Jon Moxley to defend his IWGP United States title. But everyone's hands were tied in this situation due to the pandemic. New Japan could have easily just stripped Moxley of the title, but they chose not to because it wasn't his fault. So for months and months, we played the waiting game, and it seemed like we were gonna have to wait until the pandemic was over. But things were different now. Harold May was no longer around, and AEW had formed partnerships with both NWA and Impact Wrestling. Wrestlers from both sides were still continuing to tease something between the two promotions every now and then. As we entered 2021, we all assumed that the pandemic was only slowing down the chances of this partnership happening. But in reality, to the shock of everyone, the exact opposite happened. On the last New Japan Strong episode of January 2021, Jon Moxley would make a shock appearance to attack Kenta, who at this point already had the briefcase to challenge for the IWGP US title officially. This was a shocking moment because Jon Moxley appeared for a New Japan show in the United States, something that he previously wasn't allowed to do. Moxley would get on the mic and he told Kenta that they were going to make this match happen no matter what. And the wrestling world once once again went crazy because everybody knew that this was something that Tony Khan, the AEW president, had to approve. And AEW would only add fuel to the fire by retweeting this on Twitter with the looking eyes emoji. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like this was finally possible. At the very least, AEW and New Japan were talking in some shape or form to approve this. So that was a start. And then it would be announced that Jon Moxley would be able to defend his IWGP US title against Kenta on New Japan's New Beginning USA show on February 26th. Yes, Jon Moxley was gonna be allowed to wrestle on US soil for New Japan. And this only fueled speculation on where AEW and New Japan stood now as working partners. But for Moxley, it was back to business as he was in the main event of the next week's special episode of Dynamite Beach Break, where he would team up with Rey Fenix and Pac to take on AEW World Champion Kenny Omega and the Impact Tag Team Champions, the Good Brothers. And once again, as AEW does, they provided us with an excellent main event, but it was the post-match that left the wrestling world talking once again. After picking up the win, Kenny Omega and the Good Brothers would begin to beat down Jon Moxley and his teammates. As they were getting beat down, Lance Archer would make the save to help out Jon Moxley, Phoenix, and Pac. And just as it seemed like Moxley finally had Omega to himself inside the ring, he was attacked by someone from behind who had their face covered. And then he revealed himself to be none other than Kenta. Yes, New Japan wrestler Kenta, who was scheduled to face Moxley for the IWGP US title at New Japan's New Beginning USA. After revealing his Bullet Club shirt, he would hit Moxley with the go to sleep as he stood tall in the middle of an AEW ring, and it had become official. The forbidden door had been kicked wide open. New Japan had arrived in AEW. And the moment got more surreal when Kenta and Kenny Omega traded looks. Omega was happy to see him, but Kenta was all business, which only furthers an interesting dynamic between Bullet Club USA and the OG Bullet Club. This is the partnership we've all been waiting for, and it left us in shock as the show went off the air. This is the number 2 promotion in the world and the number 3 promotion in the world finally crossing over with each other. This is the biggest crossover possible in wrestling with companies not named WWE. It's a landmark moment in professional wrestling, and the exciting part is we're only just getting started. A shared wrestling universe has just been created, and AEW serves to be the center of it all right now. We're only at the beginning, like I said, but the possibilities are endless. Okada can possibly be on TNT, and Rey Fenix and Darby Allin can possibly be on the Battle of Super Juniors. But of course, we all know what we want to see out of this partnership. Is it possible that the end game to all of this is Kenny Omega versus Kota Ibushi? Can we see that at Wrestle Kingdom, AEW champion versus IWGP champion? Or can we see it here in the United States in one big super show? It's hard not to get excited for such a monumental and frankly important partnership in professional wrestling. You can say that what's old is new because this is very reminiscent of the territory days, but with a modern twist on it. We haven't seen something like this in a very long time, and it's one of the most exciting things we could have in wrestling right now. But it all starts with Moxley and Kenta, and that's an insane way to get started. With the way anything can happen in AEW, this is why Dynamite is a must-see show, because you never know who's gonna show up. But after 2 long years of waiting, the Lion has finally showed up. And I suggest everybody strap themselves in, because we're possibly in for one of the most exciting times in wrestling since the late 90s when WCW and WWE were going head to head.